welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world. Hello, welcome. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale, and this is another in our series of the COVID-19 era podcasts. This one in particular is about the legacies of abolition and slavery, and today we're going to particularly focus on the abolition question, the legacies of abolition, and my guest is one of my favorite historians in the United States. It's James Oakes. Jim is Distinguished Professor and Humanities Professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He's a New York City native. He went to Baruch College as an undergraduate, and he did his PhD at Berkeley in California, studying with the late and great Kenneth Stamp. For those of you out there who are historians of this field, that particular intellectual lineage is very important. Ken Stamp helped create the field that we work in here in the 1950s with a great book called The Peculiar Institution, and then wrote many more books about abolitionism, Reconstruction, and so on. But his, in some ways, greatest student, Jim Oakes, has himself become one of those historians, and I don't say this lightly, who actually has changed the way we understand, think about, and teach numerous aspects of American history about the Old South, the nature of slavery and slaveholders in his book called The Ruling Race, and particularly now about the history of anti-slavery, of the abolition movements, and eventually also, importantly, of the history of political abolitionism and the Republican Party. Jim's books include 2 Lincoln Prizes, one for the book The Radical and the Republican, which is a dual intellectual biography of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and the second Lincoln Prize for the book Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery, 1861 to 1865. Both books won the Abraham Lincoln Prize. He's also the author of Slavery and Freedom, An Interpretation of the Old South, a book I used to teach in survey courses. And I already mentioned The Ruling Race, which is a history of slaveholders. And then most recently, the book Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery, 1861 to 65. And the book called The Scorpion's Sting, which in some ways is a spin-off, or actually it's a study of the earlier period from Freedom National, but in the argument, it's a bit of a spin-off from Freedom National. That book is subtitled Anti-Slavery and the Coming of the Civil War. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for doing this. This is a thrill for me.
Oh, me too. I always like talking with you. It's lots of fun.
You bet. Well, listen, let's get right into this. What we want to talk about today in this environment now, this remarkable, amazing racial reckoning that the United States is going through, there is a great deal of talk about the legacies of slavery, and there should be. In fact, our center here is doing a big project for 3 years with independent small colleges about the legacies of slavery, very broadly defined. But today we're going to talk about the legacies of abolitionism, the other side of the coin, if you like, the legacies of anti-slavery in this country, right, which has a tremendous scholarship about it. American historians have been rewriting the history of the anti-slavery movement as well as of slavery for at least half a century. Actually longer than that. But you've argued in many places that we have to think about this as at least 2 abolitions. The first being that came out of the American Revolution, from the midst of the American Revolution and in the wake of the American Revolution in the North, with all kinds of consequences. And then, of course, the second abolition, which comes in the midst of all-out civil war. Give us a sense of that. How should we understand that?
Well, it's becoming a standard theme among historians that there is one abolition that's 88 years long. And I'm very sympathetic to that, because I think that what happens to slavery in the immediate consequences and aftermath of the American Revolution is inseparable from ultimately what happens in the Civil War. In fact, no first emancipation, as it's called, no Civil War. That's if you want the simple soundbite explanation for what the legacies of the first abolition were. It's the second abolition, right? But one of the reasons just for purposes of understanding what I mean when I talk about the legacies of abolition, as opposed to the legacies of abolitionism and the movement, which is something historians also talk about, is because so much of American history would be inexplicable to us if we didn't have abolitions. If the North had not abolished slavery in the aftermath of the American Revolution, all of American history would be different. If the slave South had not been defeated in its effort to declare independence, and if slavery had not been abolished during the Civil War, nothing that happened in the after that in American history would make very much sense, right? Because these two abolitions radically transformed the social structure, the politics, the constitutional structure, the economic system of the United States in ways that we are living with today. So I think we do need to talk about the legacies of slavery. We need to talk about the legacies of abolition. We need to talk about lots of things that have shaped us the way we are, including, let's say, the legacy of, say, capitalism, for example. Can you talk about American history without talking about capitalism? Can you talk about African American history without talking about abolition or capitalism? So it's most people, when you get them sitting down, will say, yes, we need all of these things. And the emphasis in recent months, years, has been the legacies of slavery, which, you mentioned my lineage. I am the last person in the country to deny the significance of slavery. So, but I want us to understand that there's more to the history of the United States. And in some ways, you can't understand the reason we talk about the legacies of slavery is because we had an anti-slavery movement and it succeeded. And
And in that sense, every time, I wonder how you feel, but every time I hear the term America's original sin, and it's been discussed all the time now in the media, I know exactly what people mean, and I'm glad they're aware of that, and so on and so. But they mean slavery, and they mean that somehow everything about the United States and its founding and the aftermath of the founding is just swimming in a sea of its original sin.
Right.
But there's another side to that.
Yeah, what do you want to call it? Original virtue? I don't know.
I
don't know what to call it, but
don't call it treasury of virtue.
You've heard? Oh yeah, right. Don't want to be accused of that. You've heard me say this. I've said it in public several times that when I was a first-year graduate student at Berkeley, when I took my first graduate seminar, research seminar with Ken Stamp, he asked us one day to bring in a book that we admired. And you know, graduate students like to trash books. So telling us to bring in a book that we admired and explain why we admired it was a bit of a challenge. And I brought in the next week David Bryan Davis's The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. And that is the book that taught me to appreciate how truly, astonishingly revolutionary the very idea of abolishing slavery was, and that nothing like the abolition of slavery in the 18th century, starting really with the United States during the Revolution, nothing like that had ever happened in the history of the world. So that concept of the American Revolution as this major turning point in the history of the world, for that reason, has just shadowed me throughout my career. And I maybe I should dislodge it from my brain, but I can't. It's just was present at the creation of myself as a historian. So it's just been there all the time, and I've thought more and more about it, more deeply about it, I hope. And I've begun to think about it anew in the context we're in which the legacies of slavery have taken center stage in our public discussions.
Well, one thing David showed in book after book, and now of course others have too, and what you just said was anti-slavery was really born in America, far more than in Britain,
Yes.
or at least earlier. You know, we so often talk about the British anti-slavery movement as antecedent to the ultimate 19th century American abolition movement.
Right.
But abolitions are actually happening in the
Yes.
American Revolution
That's
here,
right. That's
over
right.
against Great Britain, which
That's right.
has not done it anywhere
That's
yet.
right. That's right. So if you break down this event, this series of events that Arthur Zilversmith years ago called the first emancipation.
Right.
Another stamped dissertation, by the way.
Was that right? I didn't know that. I still remember where that book is at in my bookshelf.
So you start in 1777, right? Vermont produces a state constitution that abolishes slavery, and it's followed 3 years later by Pennsylvania, which passes the very first statutory abolition statute in the history of the world. And then it just keeps going. Massachusetts abolishes slavery judicially over the 1780s. Rhode Island abolishes it in the 1780s. Connecticut abolishes it in the 1780s. Both houses of New York's legislature pass abolition statutes, and for a variety of complicated reasons don't work. But then Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance, which sets 5 northwestern states of the Old Northwest on the path to ultimately abolishing slavery on their own. And when you put all these states together that have abolished slavery, we get this thing we call the North. So we sometimes say the North abolished slavery, but a series of states abolished slavery. And what you get is, in the United States, a North and a South. You get free states and slave states. And I just ask students all the time, can you imagine American history from the Revolution to the Civil War without a North and a South, without slave states and free states? So and then you can see the consequences, the legacy of abolition are dramatic. And that's just the bare bones of it.
Sure.
We're beginning to appreciate more and more, historians have been appreciating actually more and more, the fact that one of the consequences of abolition, obviously, is in the North, is the emergence of a free Black community. And again, historians are more and more, we are coming to appreciate the central role free Blacks in the North played in the anti-slavery movement, but also in pushing to the forefront of American politics questions about citizenship. Who is a citizen? What does it mean to have, what are the privileges and immunities of citizenship? And this is pouring out of the Black community, the free Black community, the protests of and they're actively involved in an abolitionist movement that is biracial, multiracial, and shaping the contours of that movement and pushing these issues, right? So imagine American history without that, right? Which we are increasingly seeing. And then, there would imagine if no northern states had abolished slavery during the Revolution, would we be talking about the Constitution and arguing whether it was a pro-slavery Constitution or not? Because there wouldn't be any compromises between slave and free states if there were no free states.
Right.
There
would
were.
Just have been an absolutely.
It would have just been a pro-slavery. There would have been no need for a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, because without free states, the slaveholders had a common law right of recaption that they exercised all through the colonial period, because every state
nowhere for political abolitionists eventually to go to garner justification.
Exactly. And then there's the economic consequences, right? This ought to be more widely known. Unfortunately, it's actually the opposite is what people are saying. The abolition of slavery sets the North off into becoming a free labor economy. And it isn't just the abolition of slavery. It's the abolition of indentured servitude. It's the transformation of apprenticeship into a kind of form of wage labor, right? And you combine that emergence of a mobile free labor population with an agricultural economy in which land is widely available thanks to the dispossession of the Native Americans, and you get an economy in which wages are high by world standards, and wealth is relatively equitably distributed. Right? That becomes the basis for the extraordinary economic growth that the North experienced.
And a consumer market economy.
Consumer market exists. Right?
Not that the South wasn't a market economy.
It wasn't. It was a market economy that had certain limitations because it didn't have a consumer base. And you can call it capitalist if you want. I don't have a skin in the game of whether you want to call it capitalist or not capitalist. But it wasn't the same as the North, and it had certain restraints. And as the greatest of all the economic historians of slavery, Gavin Wright, in my opinion, has pointed out, it wasn't slavery. It was the abolition of slavery that set the North off on the extraordinary path of growth and development that we all see. Whereas the slave economy of the South held the South back from the kind of economic development that it might have had, because cotton could be grown by small farmers.
Sure.
We went through this with all those economic historians, went through this and figured out there are no economies of scale in the cotton economy. And that means that it could have been just as effective grown by small. And if it had been done by small farmers, the way northern wheat was grown by small farmers, it would have gotten that consumer market in the South. It would have been more robust than it was. So I think the economic differences, the political differences, the northern economy, because it is so robust, sucks in millions of immigrants who don't want to go to the South. Hundreds of thousands of Southern whites are pouring out of the South into the North. So you get more political power, more economic power, in the context of a difference between northern free states and southern slave states, and you've got the origins of the Civil War. Nothing in American history makes sense if you take away the abolition in the wake of the American Revolution.
You just used the word. I'm gonna get you to reflect very briefly on a concept, because it's one of the things that I so like about your work. Even if once or twice we once disagreed on something, I can't even recall now. But you use the word context. You are one of the historians, and then we're all committed to this, of course. But you make context, which means facts on the ground, evidence, into something almost sacred. I mean, you make it the passion and purpose of doing history. In other words, history isn't what we just want it to be. It isn't a story that we want to live in. It is actually what happened, as best we can know it. And I think I see that all the time in your work. I mean, I know this is almost a cliche. Historians believe in context. Well, of course we do, but some more than others. Yeah. And the argument you're making now is saying, but wait a minute, if all we do is look at slavery at the founding and, the roots of the United States in slavery, we will learn a great deal, and it's very important. But the other side too, the various approaches to abolition that are happening are also real. Yes. Tremendous consequences.
That's right.
And while you're thinking on that, I mean, I too wonder, again, this is a memory problem, which always interests me, but it's the gradualism of that process. The northern abolitions, not all, but many of them were gradual abolition plans. They took years and years, and people get surprised today that Connecticut still had slaves in 1832 or something, or some. But gradualism was a worldview out of the 18th century that you just can't take out of the equation. Anyway, context. You're kind of the king of context.
We have two things. Historians have two things. We have context and we have chronology.
And That's what separates us from.
That's what separates us from
social sciences.
That's right. That's right. We're not very good at structure, but we're good at context, and we should be better than we are at chronology, but we're not always as good as.
Well, and we're storytellers too, but we're
storytellers.
We can't lose that umbilical cord back to the to the context. Okay, abolition movements, an anti-slavery movement of any scale. We usually don't date. basically till we get to Garrison in the 1830s. But there's a lot happening before that.
Well, this has become also very clear, and a lot of different historians have been
Right.
telling us about this, and they don't always agree. They don't, but I don't think any longer historians are willing to say that abolitionism, for all practical purposes, begins with William Lloyd Garrison and the founding of the Liberator.
Yeah.
He himself would never have said such a thing.
No.
He fully understood. Well, for one thing, he was a protege of an earlier abolitionist, pioneering abolitionist. Oh my God, I'm dropping his name.
Benjamin Lundy.
Benjamin Lundy, right?
Down in Baltimore.
who was in some ways the inspiration for Garrison. And Lundy himself came out of an earlier context that we now understand better than we used to. So this first abolition is the inspiration for, and the second wave of abolitionism that we do associate with Garrison and the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And if you read the founding documents that Garrison had a big hand in writing, in some ways did write, they were gradualists as well. We call them immediatists because they were demanding, reasonably enough, that America immediately restore this process of gradual abolition, that masters had an immediate moral obligation to free their slaves, and that the states that were empowered to abolish slavery should immediately begin the process, right? Yeah. But that's gradualism immediately commencing, because by the time, if you think about it, New Jersey in 1804 is the last state that was a slave state to abolish slavery. The Northwestern states they were born sort of anti-slavery as territories, but it's getting on. It didn't seem to. They thought all these states are going to go, and then you get New England, and you get New York, and you get Pennsylvania, and you get and it's going to continue. And New Jersey finally does it. But we say finally does it, but nobody thought it was finally done. And people thought the next state is going to be Delaware, and then the Upper South is going to go, but it didn't. It stalled. So there's a sense by the 1830s that we're going to have to jack up the rhetoric here and force this issue back onto the table where it had been for the revolutionary generation. So there's reason to think of that second wave as a genuine second wave, but not so far removed from the first wave as we used to think. The first wave is conservative and paternalistic, and the second wave is radical.
Yeah, and it's caught up in colonization schemes, and
Well, that's not true either, right? The first wave of abolitionists were not colonizationists. They don't have
colonization until the 18-teens.
Right. They were shocked by the emergence of this. Is what Paul Polgar's new book suggests that when colonization emerges after the War of 1812, that the remnants of that earlier abolition movement, those first abolitions, are shocked. This is not what they were looking for. They imagined a future of the United States in which the freed people would gradually become incorporated into the nation as full citizens. So for them, colonization is a disastrous turn.
And one of the things you've really emphasized, you and some of your students and others, in both the Scorpion Sting book and in Freedom National, is that this conflict coming out of the early republic into the antebellum era, yes, with the cotton boom happening now and slavery is booming and expanding like crazy, that the core of it became two fundamentally different approaches to what the 18th century called natural rights.
Yes.
And the natural right to property.
Right, that's right.
There were many issues in the slavery question, but at the core, could human beings be property or not? Property in man, is it moral, is it legal or not? And how could the two ideas somehow coexist within the U.S. Constitution? That leads you ultimately to your own interpretation of what you call the irreconcilable conflict. Explain that a little bit, because it really is at the core.
And it's an important for the purpose of discussion today, for two separate reasons. First, when we talk about the legacies of the abolitionist movement, the core principle that property rights in human beings are illegitimate. They're a violation of natural law, of common law, of constitutional law, of moral law. That it injects into the mainstream of American political culture the idea that we still have to cherish today, that some things shouldn't be commodified. Some things, there are certain things that just shouldn't be for sale. And it begins with the notion that human beings should not be commodities. And we see it right up to today when, you can see it in trivial ways when people complain that Christmas has become too commercialized or something. But you could see it in more substantial ways with the argument that health care is a right, not a commodity. Right? And that is an idea that is different from a more 18th century notion of property rights as indivisible and absolute. Right. And with the development of an economy in the North that is different kinds of property, you get stocks and bonds, and you get factories and cities, and you get all sorts of different ways of regulating different forms of property. The idea that some forms of property are not legitimate and others are, and some have to be regulated this way. So it just becomes easier and easier for Northerners to accept the idea that this kind of property, it doesn't wash. It's not acceptable. Whereas the slaveholders are sort of stuck back in that 18th century notion that property is property. Slaves are no different. Slave property isn't any different from a horse or a cow or a house. And the Constitution protects property, and therefore that's all.
Yeah, they believe they have the Constitution completely on their side. And
that's right.
Before the Supreme Court, they did.
Well, even then, they only had it for 3 years.
That's true. That's true.
Nobody in the North believed it anyway. So, or not
a rough 3 years, wasn't it? And
it was quite a 3 years. Yes.
In fact, you call this is interesting. I think it's an interesting way for students and lay people to think about it. You call it two different kinds of higher law.
Yes.
The two views of property in man.
Two constitutions. And now,
two constitutions.
That's about it. And I was just reading debates this morning. I'm working on another book, and I'm reading debates in Congress, and in 1848, where the Southerners are insisting that the Northerners are violating their constitutional rights, and the Northerners are saying, "I would never violate. I believe in the Constitution," and it's as though they were talking about two different constitutions. And this is very important. This is true coming right out of the Constitutional Convention. Yes. It was very clear that Northern states had a very different conception of what the Fugitive Slave Law did, Fugitive Slave Clause did, than what the Southerners believed the Fugitive Slave Clause gave them, right? And so right away, the Northern states start passing anti-kidnapping laws and stuff like that, guaranteeing the due process rights of accused fugitives and stuff like that. So that right from the get-go.
Personal liberty laws by the 1830s.
Right from the get-go, Northerners have one conception of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, and this is what Abraham Lincoln is ultimately going to pick up on. And Southerners have a view of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document.
Well, let's name that new book. I should have at the outset, maybe, but you are now writing or almost finishing.
Yeah, it'll be out in January.
Well, then you've finished.
Yeah, I'm finished.
It's called The Crooked Path.
I may be finished by the time this book is
Well, you don't look finished. Hang in there. It's called The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. Right. So what are you doing with that book? You're rooting Lincoln's, the beginnings of the Republican Party in that tradition of anti-slavery constitutionalism.
Yes, I'm saying that coming right out of the Constitution, well, let's start with where we've already been, right? In 1776, 13 slave colonies declared their independence and became 13 slave states. There's nothing to compromise between slave and free states in 1776. Go switch ahead 11 years to the Constitutional Convention. Now there are free states. Now there are a bunch of states that have abolished slavery or are in the process of abolishing slavery. Now there has to be compromise. Right? Yeah. And they do. The Constitution is
because they're designing a future.
Right. But now there's an anti-slavery position on the table at the Constitutional Convention that wouldn't have been there in 1776 in Philadelphia. So from that, you get these compromises. And one of the things that I realized, because this just changed my mind about it, because I've always been one of those who accepts that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. And then I realized that nobody in the Republican Party believes that. The abolitionists, except for Garrison, don't believe that. And so I start pushing it all the way back. And I realized that even in the ratification debates, the anti-slavery people in the North praise the Constitution. Some attack certain features of the Constitution, but nobody says the Constitution's a pro-slavery document. They sort of like, some say, thank God we got Congress the right to abolish the slave trade, and that's the most important thing. And another one will come back and say, but we should have done it sooner. We should have let them do it now, rather. But that's it. There's nobody is saying.
Why do you think I did the same thing when way back, graduate school, when I started working on Douglass and anti-slavery, I just assumed, okay, this anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution was just a lot of false ideas that they needed.
Exactly.
It was strategy and not substance. Well, I've changed my view on that too. And certainly by the 1850s, the Garrisonian approach to the pro-slavery Constitution was waning as political anti-slavery goes. But why do you think we all started out that way? Why did we? Is it just because we see these compromises in the Constitution, or?
I'm not sure I thought about it that much until Paul Finkelman came to Princeton when I was a first-year assistant professor there and gave his talk on the pro-slavery Constitution. And I said, yeah, that sounds right to me. He had a lot of evidence. He went through all this stuff and said, yeah, there are pro-slavery elements in the Constitution. It wasn't until I encountered Frederick Douglass's interpretation when I wrote that book about Frederick Douglass. I thought, well, that's peculiar, but it's interesting. It's interesting. And the more I dug into it, I realized, you know what? He's much closer to the mainstream constitutional position of the Republican Party and of Abraham Lincoln than certainly the Garrisonians were. And then I just kept digging, and I came up now with this book. I went all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, and I went through this and realized that there is no such thing as a pro-slavery constitution among anti-slavery people until the anti-slavery constitutional argument had been well worked out by generations of anti-slavery people, including abolitionists in the 1830s, who developed all sorts of really intriguing arguments that eventually made their way into the mainstream that Abraham Lincoln is picking up. Abraham Lincoln's greatness is not his originality. It's in his ability to take ideas that were part of the anti-slavery movement, larger, not just the abolition movement, and articulate them in a particularly effective way.
He was a synthesizer.
He was a synthesizer. And so that's what makes his thought useful. He's not original in any of this stuff. And it's amazing, the more you start with Lincoln and you read these famous phrases, and the more you keep reading the people that your advisor studied, in his great book on Ballots for Freedom, and you realize they're all talking that way. They're all using very similar phraseologies, and he's just picking that up from the political culture he was a part of. So that there are, as part of the irreconcilable conflict, part of it, a good part of it politically, was two irreconcilable conceptions of the Constitution, and whether it was a pro-slavery document or an anti-slavery document.
Well, since he almost got named, I'll just name him. That was Richard Sewell, who wrote Ballots for Freedom, and indeed was my mentor.
Great book.
Truly great book. And he's still with us, I can say. And by God, I'm going to send him this podcast. He will be thrilled that you even mentioned that book. He will be thrilled.
Oh, it
was a grand synthesis of the politics of anti-slavery over time, and so deeply researched.
And I tell all of my graduate students that you start there. That's your Bible.
Yeah.
You work out from there if you're interested in it.
That's great. That's amazing.
Well, it's true, isn't it? No book.
It is true. That book is a quiet masterpiece.
It's amazing.
But can I get you to talk a bit about the argument of the book Scorpion's Sting, which is a widely taught book, partly because it's short, but it's an argument book based on evidence. But it's this metaphor that anti-slavery, particularly politicians, developed over time. It's kind of the root of the ultimate freedom national idea.
Right.
What's going on? What is the scorpion sting? How did it evolve? Who believed in it? Why was it so compelling?
Well, it goes back to the notion of the gradual abolition, right? What does gradual abolition of slavery mean? Or more precisely, what did Lincoln mean when he said he wanted the federal government to adopt policies that would put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you start the first time I read that, I remember writing an email to Sean Wilentz and saying, "What does he mean by this? What's he talking about here?" And I just started pulling on that thread. For 10 years, I've been pulling on that thread at least, and now I have a very clear sense of what that meant, because it turns out they were all using very similar language. And what it means is the federal government cannot abolish slavery in a state. Everyone agrees with that. Right? That's the federal consensus.
The Constitution is pretty explicit on
right. Well, actually, it's not explicit. It's weird. It's like
it's interpreted.
It doesn't say that, but everybody thinks everybody said that's true, even though it's not actually in the Constitution. It's just a function of federalism, right? So there are certain social status positions are not governed by the federal government. They're governed by the state. States determine who can marry who. States set labor laws. States set apprenticeship laws in localities and so on. And states set whether there's slavery or indentured servitude or not slavery.
Sure.
So it's just understood that it's something states do, and the federal government doesn't have the power to abolish slavery in the state. So how do you get slavery abolished? How does the federal government adopt policies that will abolish slavery in the states? And the anti-slavery develop over time. And Lundy is the first person actually to put it all together in 1821 in his newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. A series of policies that you don't allow slavery to expand into the West. You make it difficult for slaveholders to recapture their fugitive slaves by guaranteeing due process rights. Right? You abolish slavery. You abolish the slave trade. You certainly abolish the the coastwise slave trade, because the federal government has the power to rule navigation. Right? A slave sets foot beyond the borders of a slave state. They are presumptively free. That way,
free soil principle goes back to Britain. Yeah.
Right. And you surround the South that way with free oceans, free states to the north, free territories to the west. And gradually that means the slave economy, which is not as robust, which has certain limitations intrinsic to it, that it's gradually going to die, right? And you surround it until those states realize that it's so economically useful to them to finally get rid of this albatross that they kill it themselves, which is what people believed a scorpion does. Right? A scorpion, if it's surrounded by fire, will kill itself by stinging itself. Right? So they begin to use that metaphor. I think it in fact turns out to be not the case. I think they're actually convulsing because of the heat. But nevertheless, it was
You had to do a little research on the science.
It was believed that scorpions kill themselves. So the sting of the scorpion is the metaphor for the series of policies that the federal government can adopt without actually abolishing slavery in a state that will surround the slave states and ultimately cause the slave economy, which is intrinsically weak anyway, they believe, to one by one abolish slavery on their own.
And it became, did it not, a rather idealistic theory that this was all going to work out because, the slave system would begin to shrink, values of slaves would go down, it would begin to close in on itself, and out of rational thought, Southerners would begin to realize their future had to be
well, not so much rational thought, presumably, but presumably the balance of power in those states where slavery has declined will shift to the non-slave holders, and as was true in the northern states, you will ultimately defeat the slaveholders.
It would create a politics.
Now, it's not just abolitionists who are dreaming this stuff up. We know, and this is one of the great contributions of Bill Freeling's work, is that that's what the slaveholders were worried about.
Yeah,
they were afraid that slavery was
shrinking South. Exactly.
That's right. That it's going to start in the Upper South. that
Yep.
you're first going to lose Delaware and
Mhm.
Kentucky and Missouri, and gradually it's going to get smaller and smaller in the slave state, and the loyalty of the non-slaveholders would become suspect and things
Mhm.
like that. They're worried about the thing that anti-slavery people are encouraged to buy. So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
kind of a universal sense in a large part of the country, except for, there are these middle ground people like Stephen Douglas who thinks, oh,
Mhm.
we've been half slave, half free forever, and we can go on forever
Sure.
being half slave, half free. What's the problem? But the majority of Northerners, pro-slavery Southerners, and majority of anti-slavery Northerners did not believe that. They
Yeah.
believed that slavery could be wiped out gradually. I mean, take a radical like Thaddeus Stevens, right?
Mhm.
Stevens
Mhm.
gives one of the most controversial speeches in Congress during the great debates over the Compromise of 1850. What he
Mhm.
says is that if we adopt all of these measures to surround the slave states with a cordon of freedmen, he says,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
I guarantee you that within 25 years, the last of the slave states will have adopted a gradual abolition law. Right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we're talking about, this is a radical saying
Mhm. Mhm.
25 years from now, the
Mhm.
last slave state will adopt a gradual abolition law. Right? So that means that if it's a post-Natty abolition law, right,
Yeah.
it means that the last slave born the day before the last state law is passed lives
Right.
to 75 years.
Mm.
That's 100 years. So when Lincoln says,
That came
I
from somewhere.
imagine
Yeah.
I imagine that
Yeah.
that if slavery were abolished in the most peaceful, most gradual way,
Right.
100 years from now, the last slave will die. Right?
Well, then how do you, I mean, if a student asks you, well, as I am, how do you then judge their misjudgment? That is, they really believe this, or they wanted to believe, let's say, that this process of history was going to be relatively peaceful. There'd be great political
Right.
conflict,
Right.
but there wouldn't be such violence.
Well, I have
Now,
two things to
were
say.
they underestimating the sheer fervor and power of pro-slavery
They,
politics?
I think they underestimated the profitability of slavery. That's for sure.
There,
I think
okay,
they,
yeah.
they, they certainly underestimated that. I think they underestimated the fact that what we now know, and economic historians tell us all the time, that the
Mhm.
slave economy did not need to expand geographically to thrive. That there was that the
It was
amount of
economically doing very well.
well, also that the amount of acreage devoted to cotton doubled between 1865 and 1890 and doubled again without expanding beyond the border. So there was a lot of room for slavery and the
Mm,
cotton economy to
mm,
thrive
mhm,
without any more expansion. So you could have closed it off and
mm.
wouldn't necessarily have died. There are all sorts of arguments to that. And I'm less interested in whether or not that's a might have been.
Yeah.
My argument is doesn't matter whether they were right or wrong, and there's no point in wringing your hands over the fact that it would have taken so long, because it didn't take so long.
Mhm.
The historically significant thing about that is that as soon as a man was elected president who
Yeah.
believed that, the slave states left.
Right.
It was the cause of the Civil War,
Yeah.
and its significance doesn't depend on whether it worked or would have worked or not. It's like saying the Nat Turner Rebellion isn't significant because it failed. Well, that's not, success and failure isn't the historical criterion we need here,
Right.
right? Because it sets in motion the Civil War, and once the Civil War starts, the whole game is changed, right?
Mhm.
Because the anti-slavery people have also developed a whole series of arguments about you will, whatever constitutional rights you have, and they're
Mhm.
not as many and as significant as you think they are, but whatever ones you have, you secede from the Union and you have forfeited those rights. Immediately, you will not get your slaves back. Lincoln
Okay.
says that
You've engaged in a
clearly,
revolution. Good luck.
unambiguously. He says it. He said it in 1859, and he
Uh-huh.
said it again in his inaugural address. You complain that you can't get your slaves back, right?
Mhm.
But you leave the Union, and your slaves, now only partially returned, will not be returned at all. He
Mhm.
says it in his inaugural address. And we know that's what happens. That's
Sure.
what happens.
Sure.
You know?
Let me, but as a way of asking you a question, a quick story about Dick Sewell, which I may have told you before. I don't remember. I was his TA circa 19, well, I won't give the year. Um, And he comes to observe me in a class. And I had a great class, man. The students were into it. And I'd come right out of high school teaching. What did I know? And I had made the case that in the secession crisis, we'd been reading, I forget who we had been reading Stamp's Imperiled Union, I think. Anyway, I had been pushing the argument in the section that the South had kind of misinterpreted Lincoln, that the Republicans were only going to stop the expansion of slavery. They weren't really a threat where it existed. We walked back to Dick's office afterward, and he said, "Come on in here." And I'll never forget this.
You need some learning, boy.
Humiliated. Dick said something nice like, you really need to rethink that idea about the South misinterpreting.
Right.
They actually had Lincoln pretty well right.
They did.
That the Republicans were a fundamental threat to the future of slavery,
existential,
whatever position they had taken. Now, you have taken that idea, particularly in Freedom National, and shown that this Republican Party, make that argument here, that that Republican Party, this is only 6 years old when Lincoln becomes president, this anti-slavery coalition, and as you show, they're no treasury of virtue. They got racists, they got know-nothings, but they are a classic coalition.
The coalition. Yeah. But they had a base, and the base was strongly anti-slavery.
Talk about that, because we hear all the time today about the base right. In politics. The base of the Republican Party
was radical anti-slavery folks. Right? Mm-hmm. This is Eric Foner's big point. Yes, the Republican Party is a coalition, and you can see Lincoln all through the late 1850s saying, "Look, guys, tone it down on this."
Sure.
The stuff on fugitive slaves, because we're going to lose the conservative Whigs in Illinois, and I guarantee you stuff like that. We need those guys.
He didn't know he couldn't trust the radicals.
Right. It's not that he couldn't trust them, because he really admired. Look what he did with Owen Lovejoy. Right. He told the conservatives in Illinois to shut it up about Owen Lovejoy. He's got the base of this party, and we can't do without those people. And he said things like that about the abolitionists and the radicals several different times. He understood that they were the indispensable base of the party, but that if the party wanted to win, they were going to have to get alienated Democrats, conservative Whigs as well. So they tone it down and they reduce the project to its single most important element, which is banning slavery from the Western territories. But this is the point of my new book. They embed that policy in a very robust and radical theory of anti-slavery constitutionalism that appeals to the base of the party, which is radical. So that, I'll give you one example. They don't just say in their platforms in 1856 and 60 that Congress should abolish slavery in the Western territories. Mm-hmm. What they say is, Congress has no constitutional power to allow slavery in the Western
That's
territories.
A different, that's
and when you, why not? Because in the Western territories, the Constitution rules, and the Constitution guarantees due process rights to everyone. And when a slave is carried into the territories, the slave can sue the master on a writ of habeas corpus, and the master will have no statute that he can point to that says, I can legitimately own you here, right? And because the Constitution prevails, and the Constitution does not contain a pro-slavery statute, it's anti-slavery, right? So they're fleshing out these notions of like the Fifth Amendment, right? The Constitution is a pro-slavery document, but the Fifth Amendment says no person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law. Is that a pro-slavery clause?
Well, the property part of it, again, that's the divided Constitution. The Fifth Amendment.
Right, but they're also saying that the slaves have a natural right to property in themselves. Can they be deprived of their property right in themselves without due process of law?
In themselves, right.
Right. So they've got this completely worked out, and it's all there in the 1856 and 1860 platforms, right? And if you don't know, if you've grown up as we did, thinking the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, you're not going to recognize what's in those platforms. You won't see that these are anti-slavery.
And as you know, Jim, we always have, even historians like you, and I think I do too, write for broader audiences than just our
We try.
immediate
It's not
colleague. We try. But out there in America, there is a wide belief or sensibility, maybe, that America's founding was just all caught up in slavery. So I don't know if this is the last question, but let me get you to reflect on this Legacies of Abolition again,
okay.
because in a sense, is the problem about how we think broadly in the national memory, let's say, about abolition, that, they're not just they're not all radical. They're a mixture of points of view and backgrounds. And some of them are sometimes so moderate about this issue or that issue. There's a tendency that if these people were, radicals, then they're not pure enough.
Oh, the purity
Because they were still racist. Well, okay. But again, we want our abolitionists like we want our Lincoln, like we want a lot of things, our founders, whatever. We want them pure.
Right.
And there's nothing pure about this movement. It's a complicated.
Other than Gandhi, name a pure person.
Well, I don't know. And even he
He
did some awkward things in South Africa,
Right.
God.
No, I saw
his monument down at some
I saw somebody say the other day online, and I had said it privately in email, that we need to understand the attacks on the Confederate monuments as representatives of the Confederacy. It doesn't matter whether the statue was Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or Jefferson Davis. What those statues represent is this abomination we call the Confederacy, this treason attempt to destroy the U.S. government, right? It doesn't matter who it is. Think of a Lincoln statue or a Grant statue the same way. Whatever the imperfections of the individuals, the reason those statues are there is for what they represent. And what they represent, what certainly Grant, for example, represents, is the general who did more than any other general to destroy the Confederacy and then goes on to suppress the Klan. The fact that he at one point inherited a slave who he subsequently emancipated, that's an imperfection that is of no historical significance, is what he represents. And what Lincoln represents, whatever his shortcomings on the matters of racial equality, what he represents is the president who suppressed the Confederacy and shepherded the emancipation of the slaves through the war.
Well, that's one of the reasons I've supported keeping the Freedmen's Memorial. Only one of the reasons. There's even a deeper reason to me, which is because Black people created that monument.
That's right.
Douglas gave his second greatest speech there.
Exactly.
But there is a tendency. We want to purify our past.
It's not the purity or impurity of the individuals.
There is no purified past. It's just
it's what do they represent in American history.
And well, go ahead. Sorry.
I heard a discussion this morning on another podcast about this similar issue with Churchill. Right? Churchill has all sorts of things in his back. He was an imperialist, what he did bring in. But what he represents in England, the significance he has for England is he was anti-fascist from the start, and he shepherded the country through World War II.
You can't separate Churchill from the British Empire. He's born to it.
Exactly.
He lived.
That's not why his statue is up there outside Westminster Cathedral. It's up there next to Abraham Lincoln's because of what he represents. What are they?
Something actually quite moving if people get serious about remembering. Well, flaws is the word we always use. The flaws in leadership, at the same time, they rise to do something that actually changes the world. But here we have this abolition story, and I do think, and you've written so many pages to do this, and as have historians, as I said, for half a century. Abolitionism in America, in its various forms, the two abolitions, the various stages it takes, from really moderate to really radical, is the prototypical American reform or radical movement. It is. Everything gets compared to it. Left and right, everything gets compared.
And why would progressives today want to abandon one of the most important precedents they have for how you build a progressive coalition and do something truly revolutionary. This is like one of the, maybe the only time this happened in American history. Watch how it happened. Learn from how that happened. If there are such things as lessons of history, that's what you look for. That's what, I'm not big on, little lessons of history, but the fact is that
that's because you're in that concrete of context back there.
No, but the truth is, I have to be
sorry.
The truth is, to be honest, that was what I got interested in that book on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln.
Oh yeah,
That's what I've been interested in ever since. How do you build a coalition that does something truly remarkable? And don't worry,
very different places and points of view, but
don't get caught up on the purity and the impurity. If we, there were lots of things about Frederick Douglass that we wish he hadn't said and wish he hadn't done.
Sure. God knows.
I said this last week to a friend of mine. I said, when they started attacking the Lincoln statues and the Grant statues, I said, wait till they find out that Frederick Douglass blamed the Irish potato famine on the drunkenness of the Irish.
Wait till they find out that he had very contemptuous things to say about American Indians.
Right. Or Chinese.
Well,
he was, he
was better in the 20s.
But it's ridiculous. That's not why he's important.
No.
Not important because he was perfect. He was important for reasons that we rightly think of as important. Right. So
it's kind of our job to keep telling people to stop looking for purity in the past in order to find something righteous in the present.
Right.
I mean, it seems like a cliche, but it is part of our job to keep telling people that. Well,
that's what I thought your dissertation advisor did so beautifully.
He was.
That's what that book showed.
It did.
Right? How do we
showed
build a coalition?
By the late 1850s, there was an anti-slavery coalition built over time that was, to some degree at least, ready, if conflict came,
to do to
not step back,
take the bull by the horns, right? So that, sure, are they pushed by the contingencies of war? Of course they are, but which direction? I mean, what if Andrew Johnson had been president? How would he have been pushed by the contingencies of war? You take somebody like Lincoln and he'll go one way when he's pushed. You take somebody else and they'll go a different way. Stephen Douglas wouldn't have gone his way, that way, in the context of a war. So it's generations of building this anti-slavery constitutionalism, this anti-slavery political coalition, this anti-slavery party that takes control of the federal government during the Civil War and is pushed and responds to these contingencies in ways that are predictable given where they've come from.
If you could say one thing, I know this is impossible, but if you could say one thing about the way abolitionists should be remembered, maybe even honored, since we're in this monument moment today, what would it be?
That they were much more politically savvy and pragmatic about the possibilities than we give them credit for. And that we should, there's a certain way in which the kind of anti-politics that came out of the 60s that looked for purity doesn't appreciate how important it is to have people who know how to use power and who are very savvy about the use of power, like Lincoln was, like FDR was, like Lyndon Johnson was. Remember the last time we had a president who was really politically savvy and could do progressive things with that ability.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. In fact, one of my pet peeves, not a pet peeve, but a thing I keep trying to say every time I'm on any program or podcast is that I'm wishing that the Biden campaign would create, among its many task forces, a task force about how do you harness this moment. Not just in economic policy, which is crucial, absolutely
crucial,
and in policing legislation, and in a federal anti-lynching law. I mean, all of that is in that bill. But why not create a commission? I don't know what you want to call it, but about this idea that if the Confederate memorial landscape is coming down in this country, what are we going to replace it with? How should we imagine a new commemorative landscape? And how might the government play a role in helping us get there?
Yeah. Do you worry that, I mean, I hate those statues. We all, you know,
Yeah.
we're part of a world. We hate those statues, right? But I wonder if erasing the past is one of
Yeah.
the intended consequences of what the Confederacy is. A very important thing we need to remember.
Oh
Right?
God,
We
yes.
have we have Holocaust memorials
Right.
because we should remember dark things about the past. And the Confederacy, that I always thought that the best thing to do with Confederate statues was, if you go to the University of Mississippi, you'll see they've redone all of the statuary, all of this, and written new plaques that explain very honestly what was going on, so that you understand what this statue represents, when it was put up, why it was put up, so that you don't forget the past and you don't just pull it down. You
No, I don't want it erased either. In fact, you know, all the more reason to teach about the Confederacy, because if you don't know about the Confederacy, then you don't know about the lost cause. If you don't know about the lost cause, you don't understand segregation. You don't understand segregation. You don't understand lynching, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But it's possible. I mean, all this could lead to a whole lot of forgetting, and I hope not. But somebody's got to harness this
energy.
Yeah, energy, right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of energy, good Lord, we could go on forever, but we haven't.
Yeah, and I didn't even get to the legacies of the abolition in the Civil War, but that's for another day.
I know, which is the biggest of all in some way.
Exactly.
Well, take a crack at it. Come on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, emancipation comes out of war, and it transforms the United States.
It transforms
everything.
Everything about the South is transformed, right? You go from a slaveholding class that is transformed, that is destroyed, and becomes a landowning class with an entirely different set of powers and possibilities and limitations, as well as strengths, right? You go from a slave labor system, a gang-based slave labor system, which to some extent depends on the master's ability to break up families when they need to, and to a sharecropping system, which is family-based, and which depends on the existence of families. You go from a system in which they use the convict labor as slavery by another name, but you go from a system in which 95% of Southern blacks are enslaved to one in which 1% are imprisoned. You have a fundamentally different system of social organization. Right? Yes, it's not slavery by another name. You can even say, following David Oshinsky, it's worse than slavery. In some ways, it was worse than slavery, but it's not
brutal exploitation.
Not the same as slavery. A slavehold, somebody who employs 25 prisoners. That is a story of a Louisiana planter who employed 25 prisoners one year, and half of them were dead by the time the year was over. Well, slaveholders were not in the business of killing half their slaves every year. Their slaves were valuable capital assets, and part of what was significant to them was, when they talked about a good crop, was increasing the number of slaves from year to year, because they're valuable, right? You have no value to someone who is renting you from a prison, right? So you exploit them to death in a way that would have been economically suicidal for slaveholders to do. It's just a fundamentally different system, a system in which it is a crime to teach a slave to read is not the same thing as a system in which your children are educated in segregated classrooms. They're two very different ways of organizing society. But the issues, the political issues, are radically transformed. As we said earlier, the politics of slavery center around the legitimacy and delegitimacy of property rights in human beings. That's gone. As soon as there is emancipation, there is a Civil Rights Act, a 14th Amendment guaranteeing civil rights, a 15th Amendment about voting rights, Civil Rights Voting Act. There's even talk of redistribution. Should they distribute the land? These are the politics we live with.
Small attempt at it in South Carolina.
Yes, we live with those politics. We live with the politics created by emancipation, by abolition, right? And so it's not enough to talk about the legacies of slavery. You must talk about the legacies of abolition, because that's where we, to a large extent, are and have been ever since slavery was abolished in the United States. That's the short version.
We live in the land that
those are our issues.
Yes, they are.
Issues. Civil rights, Voting
We're fighting out the meaning of the 14th Amendment every day in our society.
and voting rights, voter suppression.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
There's nobody complains about the suppression of slaves' votes. Nobody talks about the civil rights of slaves.
Right.
There's no redistribution of property among slaves. It only arises in the context of emancipation, in the context of abolition.
It's a changing kind of oppression, but it's different.
It's different. It's fundamentally different, and the politics of it are fundamentally different, and the day-to-day lives of Black people in the South are different from and where the families are now secure, for better or worse, right? They're, you know, the sharecropping unit is not the same thing as a slave labor gang.
Right.
It's just from day-to-day experience all the way up to high politics. It is a radically revolutionized world that they're living in, and the politics of that world are surprisingly like the politics of ours. We still talk about redistribution. We are talking more about redistribution than we have in a very long time.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where you saw it. You know, should they redistribute the wealth, which was land, right? That's where you saw it.
They had to think about it.
They had to think about it.
Because of the results of the war.
Because of abolition.
In a situation where we may have to think about it because the whole house came down.
Exactly. That's my point about don't lose sight of the legacies of abolition while we're talking about the legacies of.
Well, Jim, I am so glad we did this. This has been great fun for me to partly reminisce, but mostly to discuss history with you. So thanks for doing this. And we'll have this out soon in all our possible networks. And
someday when the world gets better, we'll actually sit down and
we'll do it in person again in the CUNY auditorium or the Yale auditorium where we've done these things.
Maybe
before.
when my book comes out.
There you go. You're on. We'll do a book event next. When's it coming out? January. Well, hopefully we'll be in person by then. So.
Maybe. Or with masks.
With masks, right. All right, man.
Great seeing you, David. Thank you
so much for doing this.
Sure. My pleasure.
And thank you all out there for listening. I'm David Blight. This is a podcast from the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition at Yale. Thank you all for listening. As always, the Gilder Lehrman Center welcomes contributions from those who support our work and our mission. To give, please go to the link in the event invitation, visit the GLC web page, and click on Donate, or email the Gilder Lehrman Center for more information. The Gilder Lehrman Center is conducting a widespread fundraising campaign to sustain all of the activities we do in the coming years, and we welcome any help you can give us. Thank you very much.